Welcome to the OK Let's Learn podcast. This is two podcasts in one where we dive into tons of interesting topics, and another where we dive into tons of interesting books and stories. My name is Kevin O'Keefe. So today, OK, let's learn all about the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was the morning after Paul Revere ran through the countryside, warning that the regulars were on their way. And yes, it began the American Revolution. Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here. These are words of John Parker, who commanded the local Lexington militia, and they were the ones that stood across the Lexington Green from the Redcoats. Who would fire first? Do we know today? Do we? But what's a fact is what we do know is that this one shot began a revolution, began a war between child and parent. The colonies against the British Empire. It lasted for 8 years, and it was known as the American Revolution. And we would not be here as the United States of America if it didn't happen on this one morning, April 19th, 1775. So, okay, let's learn. On Tuesday evening, April 18th, 1775, General Thomas Gage, the commander of the British forces in Boston, faced a difficult assignment. He wasn't simply the commander of this British army in Massachusetts. He was also the royal governor. He had been ordered to restore British authority without creating a larger rebellion. For months, he had received reports that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress was putting together muskets, ammunition, food, tents, gunpowder, artillery, you mention it, in towns all across Boston. Concord, which was approximately 18 miles northwest of Boston, had a lot of these munitions, so the plan was put forward. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith, he was in charge. He would take the Redcoats, go out to Concord, figure out, find the supplies, destroy what he couldn't carry away, and go back to Boston. It wasn't intended to be a raid. It wasn't supposed to be the beginning of a war. Gage gave Smith instructions to secure the bridges in Concord because controlling those crossings would be essential if the soldiers were going to search the town safely. But Gage's secret was already leaking. Boston spies got wind of the plan, and we still don't know who and how and when, but we know that Paul Revere and William Dawes was sent out to warn the countryside by Dr. Joseph Warren. You can go back to my previous episode about the midnight ride of Paul Revere, but know this, that 700 Redcoats were on their way to Concord. As Paul Revere knocked on the door of Samuel Adams and John Hancock, Captain John Parker was also notified. He was not a professional officer. He was a farmer. He was a mechanic, a family man, your typical well-known guy in Lexington. And he was not well. He was sick, but yet here he was. He was the elected captain of the local militia. And here's the thing, technically his men weren't Minutemen. Technically, the Minutemen were selected militia members. They were expected to be ready in very short notice. But in the confusion of that night, the Minutemen were right there with these regular militia guys, local farmers, craftsmen, you name it. And here they were, getting ready, confused, but ready to fight. It's now 1 a.m., and Parker ordered his men to gather on the common. This is the open area now called the Lexington Green. You can still go there and experience and see it today. And I have to emphasize this again. Here were men that all knew each other from church, town meetings, the farms, the shops, the family gatherings. There were the Parkers, the Monroes, the Harringtons, and yes, John Parker's cousin, Jonas Parker, with Jonas's 21-year-old son, was there as well. At first, there were no British soldiers. They were sitting there waiting in the cold darkness, stressed, worried, wondering. There were some that were sent out to scout the road. Others just went into the local Buckman Tavern to keep warm. It was cold that morning. It's now 3 a.m. and Colonel Francis Smith knew that everyone was out and about and people had been alarmed and were ready for them. So he made two decisions. First, he sent a messenger back to Boston requesting reinforcements from General Gage. Second, he ordered Major John Pitcairn to have a couple hundred of his redcoats move quickly towards Lexington ahead of the main group of soldiers. They were suited for this assignment. They were trained to move faster and fight in a more open formation than the larger group of soldiers. Pitcairn reportedly ordered them to load their muskets, but not to fire unless ordered. Back in Boston, Gage did not have a clear moment-to-moment picture of what was happening. There were, of course, no ways to communicate other than someone getting on a horse and getting the information back to them. He would not know that his secret mission had become an armed confrontation until reports reached him. And when did it get back to him? Not until the conflict was over, until the first shots were fired at Lexington. He wasn't near the battlefield. He couldn't command what they were doing. So the movements went on to Concord. Just as Gage had ordered, it was too late to get information back and forth. The die had been cast. It's now 4:30 in the morning. In Lexington, a scout named Thaddeus Bowman came racing back. The regulars are on their way. They're coming. Parker ordered the militia to get together again. Lexington's teenage drummer, William Diamond, beat the call to arms. Men emerged from Buckman Tavern and nearby homes and gathered on the common. Reports suggested there was only 70 to 80 guys out there ready to fight. And how many redcoats were marching into town? 700. That's 10-1 odds against the Patriots. Parker had basically said that they were getting together to consult on what to do. His thought was to show that Lexington was prepared, but he didn't intend to start a war. He didn't intend to even start a battle right there at the Greening. They gathered on the northwestern part of the common, facing the road from Boston. Some had loaded muskets, others didn't. His exact words, Parker's exact words, are still uncertain today, but his basic orders were much clearer. Do not fire unless fired upon. One of the redcoats, William Sutherland, saw shots and flashes at the side of the road. He believed they were signals, again, to people in the countryside. But the bottom line is Sutherland warned Pitcairn, who stopped the soldiers and had them load. They moved forward to the center of Lexington. Then they saw Parker's men. Disperse! Lay down your arms! Go home, rebels! Parker saw the numbers were against him. He saw more redcoats approaching the Green. Stacks and stacks of redcoats. Parker gave the order to stand down, to disperse. They ended up breaking formation and they moved away. They moved back. They turned around and were walking away, but they were still carrying their guns. The redcoats didn't want them. They wanted them to disarm. Parker wanted his men to leave without surrendering their weapons. In fact, remember, this is Not a standing army on the Patriot side. These are just men who own their own individual weapons for defense. They weren't going to put down their arms. This was the moment that changed everything. The militia and men were moving in all different directions. Officers were shouting. Some British troops were still entering the green. And then it happened. A gunshot rang through the air. No one knew who fired. For a long 2 seconds, everything was quiet. Then a redcoat fired indiscriminately. Another line of soldiers fired. White smoke is everywhere. No one can see. Musket balls were tearing through the dispersing militia. Men ran for stone walls. They ran for cover buildings anywhere they could. Some turned and fired back, apparently without Parker's order. British officers tried to stop their soldiers, but discipline had broken down. Some regulars charged with bayonets. The entire fight lasted less than 3 minutes. Jonas Parker, John Parker's cousin, remained on the green. He fired his musket. He began reloading and was struck down by a British musket ball. He couldn't move. He couldn't escape. He was killed with a bayonet. This is John Parker's cousin, and Jonas's son was there and witnessed the whole thing. Junior escaped. John Parker escaped. Many people skirmished. Many people scattered. It was over before it began. 8 Lexington men were killed. Jonas Parker, Robert Monroe, Samuel Hadley, John Brown, Caleb Harrington, Jonathan Harrington, Isaac Muzzy, and Assail Porter. Only one redcoat was wounded. At this point, the redcoats were in control. Now they were off to Concord, 6 miles northwest. But as the redcoats were marching, they could hear the sounds in the distance. They could hear the people getting up and getting ready to fight again. It's now 6 o'clock in the morning. And reports slowly but surely are reaching Concord that blood had been shed in Lexington. It's now 7 a.m. Right at this moment, the Concord militia and Minutemen were heavily outnumbered, 3-1. The overall senior commander was Colonel James Barrett. He was a respected local officer, had been responsible for managing many of the military supplies in Concord. He didn't want his men to be defeated. So they withdrew through Concord. They crossed this old North Bridge and moved to higher ground on top of this Punkatassett Hill. It was approximately a mile beyond the town center. The British entered Concord. Lieutenant Colonel Smith began carrying out Gage's orders. Detachments secured the North Bridge and South Bridge. Other soldiers searched houses, barns, and public buildings for weapons and supplies. At about 7, a little after 7 a.m., light infantry companies were sent across the North Bridge towards Colonel Barrett's farm, where the British expected to find cannon and military supplies. 3 companies, approximately 100 soldiers, remained near the bridge under Captain Walter Laurie to protect the crossing. They found some supplies, but far less than Gage had hoped. The Patriots had been moving military supplies for weeks. Once the alarm arrived that morning, local people moved quickly to hide and get rid of everything that they had stored. In Concord, British soldiers found wooden gun carriages, barrels of flour, musket balls, and other material. They damaged and burned some supplies, and they dumped some flour and musket balls into the water, but the town people later recovered many of those musket balls, and some of the flour was actually saved because the soldiers did not completely destroy it. At Barrett's farm, his wife, Rebecca, had actually served breakfast to the officers while the search was continuing. This was not an immediate face-off like there was at Lexington. The redcoats were going about the job of trying to find all these munitions. They didn't find anything. They certainly didn't find anything of major importance. The cannon and the most valuable weapons had already been moved or hidden. While the redcoats were looking and searching, the Patriots came out larger by the minute. Local towns, Acton, Bedford, Lincoln, Westford, we're all now approaching Concord. It's now 9 a.m. There's 400 militia and Minutemen and only about 100 redcoats guarding the bridge. For the first time that day, the numbers were in the Patriots' favor. The Patriot officers moved their men closer to the bridge onto a ridge where they could see not only the bridge, but all of Concord. Immediately, they knew there was trouble. Smoke was rising from the town. The British were burning captured wooden cannon carriages. They were burning just that. Accidentally, the fire ended up going to another building, but in the chaos and the confusion, the Patriots had no idea that they were just burning separately captured munitions. They just figured that their whole town was about to be burned to the ground. Now, what would they do? Are they going to stand by and watch their town destroyed? Colonel Barrett ordered the men to load their weapons but not to fire unless the British fired first. The companies formed by seniority. Major John Buttrick of Concord and Lieutenant Colonel John Robinson of Westford moved near the front. Captain Isaac Davis led the action Minutemen, whose company took the leading position. Davis was 30 years old. He was a gunsmith, and he was the father of 4 young children. His men were well equipped, and their bayonets made them particularly suitable to lead and advance. People had always asked if Davis's men were up to the challenge. He said, "I haven't a man that's afraid to go." So now 400 armed colonists began marching toward the bridge in double file. It was no longer a scattered gathering of frightened farmers. They marched in an organized column, accompanied by drums and fifes. Ahead of them, Captain Walter Laurie's 96 British soldiers saw them approaching. Laurie's position was becoming dangerous. The British companies initially occupied ground on the western side of the bridge, between the colonists and the road to Barrett's farm. As the militia approached, Laurie pulled his men back across the bridge towards Concord. The British soldiers began giving conflicting instructions. Some soldiers were told to move toward the field. Someone suggested tearing up the bridge planks. Laurie attempted to arrange his men in a narrow filing formation near the eastern end of the bridge. The position was poorly suited to the task. Only the men at the front could fire freely, while those behind them were crowded into the road. The militia column came closer, 100 yards, 70 yards, 50 yards. Then several British shots were fired. The first shots apparently struck the water. For a moment, the militia continued forward. Then the British fired directly into the head of the column. Patriot Luther Blanchard down, Abner Hosner down, Isaac Davis down. Other men fell wounded. Major John Buttrick was close enough to see the men at the front of the column collapse. Then he gave the order, "Fire! Fire! For God's sakes, fire!" This return fire at Concord's North Bridge is really what a lot of people say is the shot heard round the world. This wasn't the chaotic situation at Lexington. This was an organized American force that was advancing on the redcoats. 3 of the British soldiers were down, killed, and 9 were wounded. The Americans crossed the bridge. For the first time that day, British soldiers were retreating from American fire. But there was a pause. The Patriots encountered more troops coming to support Laurie. Both sides formed formations, but neither engaged with each other. The militia eventually withdrew towards the bridge and surrounding hills. Meanwhile, the Redcoats who had searched Barrett's farm marched across Northbridge. They passed the bodies of their fallen comrades. They had their wounded men to carry, their ammunition was limited, and now militia companies were arriving from all over Massachusetts. And the road home, the road to Boston, back to safety, was 18 miles away. He had sent for help from Boston, and no help was there. He was on his way home, and he knew that he was still facing danger. It's now 12 noon, and the Redcoats begin their long journey back to Boston. But meanwhile, the militia is waiting. They're waiting in the woods. They're waiting behind ridges. They're waiting behind roads and walls. A half an hour later, near Marion's Corner, the fighting began again. But this wasn't a face-off. This was an attack that continued on and off from the woods behind trees. It was an ambush. It was guerrilla warfare for the next 18 miles as the Redcoats sprinted and ran and tried to save their own skin. Now it's 1:30 in the afternoon. And remember John Parker? Well, now he had gotten his men back together. It's on the border of Lexington and Lincoln, and he led an ambush on the Redcoats. They called it Parker's Revenge. This hero who stood up to the mighty British Empire would tragically pass away only 4 months later from tuberculosis. But here he was on the battlefield again, helping the Patriot cause. The Redcoats are still on the run. Colonel Smith was shot in the leg. Major Pitcairn lost his horse and was thrown to the ground. He survived, but soldiers were dropping from wounds and exhaustion and heat. Ammunition was running low. This disciplined retreat was now becoming a run. It's now 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and Smith's soldiers were exhausted, but they saw a wall of red ahead of them. General Gage's reinforcements had finally arrived. General Hugh Percy had 1,000 additional troops, and he set up outside Lexington on higher ground. Smith's battered soldiers staggered behind Percy's line, and for the first time, British cannons fired towards the Patriot militias, and they pulled back temporarily. Percy's arrival, no doubt, saved all of Smith's men, or certainly most of them. It's now 3:30, and Percy began the long march back, continuing to Boston. He had now 1,700 men. He didn't push forward. He didn't attack. Instead, he continued back towards the safety of Boston. There were more skirmishes, there were more fighting, and Dr. Joseph Warren had actually been out there as well, and he almost got hit right near his ear. Finally, the day was ending. 49 killed on the American side, 39 wounded, 5 missing. The Redcoats, 73 killed, 174 wounded, 26 missing. The immediate consequences. The news spread rapidly throughout the colonies. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress gathered testimony and hurried its version towards London, determined to show the king that the British had fired first. Of course, General Gage produced his own account, but the argument over the first shot couldn't change what happened. What did happen? It wasn't just tea being thrown into the harbor, and it wasn't even the misunderstandings and what happened all those years ago at the Boston Massacre. This was on purpose. Colonists killed King George's soldiers, and the soldiers had killed the colonists. The British Army had marched into the countryside to confiscate Patriot weapons, but it now felt itself really trapped inside Boston, because within days, thousands of New England militiamen had surrounded the city. This was the beginning of a provincial army and eventually ended up becoming the Continental Army under George Washington, who would arrive months later. So what would happen next? History showed that this tension could not be resolved immediately, despite so many people really not wanting to fight each other. It did. It continued. And 2 months later, on June 17th, 1775, on the heights above Charleston, soldiers would build defenses during the night, and the British redcoats would form at the bottom of the hill. Don't fire. Let them come closer and closer. This would be the Battle of Bunker Hill. But that, my friends, is for another episode, another time. Please know that we will tackle all the major events of the American Revolutionary War. Just keep coming back. For now, thanks for taking this journey, learning all about the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Reach out to me at kevmok21@gmail.com. What you like about the podcast, what you don't like, suggestions for future episodes, anything, especially my loyal listeners. I'd love to hear from you. Hit that plus button in the top right-hand corner of Apple Podcasts. That will subscribe you to the podcast so you can get notifications automatically on your phone of the next episodes. We are on YouTube. We are on Facebook. We are on Spotify. Keep those reviews, keep those ratings coming. And until next time, have fun and keep learning.